Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a smoky longhouse on a damp coastal evening where the scent of seaweed clings to wool cloaks and the flickering hearth throws shadows across carved beams. You sit cross-legged on fur-covered planks, sipping warm ale out of a carved horn, while the sounds of chewing, soft laughter, and a suspiciously grumpy goat fill the room. This is the Viking world, not the one of pillaging and shouting, but of flirting glances passed across firelight and stolen moments behind timber walls. Love in the Viking Age isn't all grand epics and blood oaths. Sometimes it's more like, hey, you dropped your fishnet. Can I walk you home? But you probably won't survive this if you're allergic to smoke, sarcasm, or strong cheese. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're now settled among a community that works hard, fights hard, and, surprisingly, feels quite deeply. Love. Here smells like burnt peat, sour ale, and wet wool. The longhouse is the heart of it all, a kind of love incubator where extended families eat, sleep, flirt, and argue all under one dramatically sagging roof. You spot a young man carving tiny knots into a length of wood, occasionally glancing up at a girl tending to the stew. She doesn't look at him directly, but the faintest smile curls at the corner of her mouth when he accidentally drops the carving and scrambles too loudly after it. That's about as steamy as things get, for now. You notice that courtship here is a community sport. Everyone's watching. Auntie Thora whispers with Uncle Bjorn, and Great Granny Inga pretends to sleep while tracking every eye twitch. Privacy? Not really a thing. Young people might find slivers of alone time while fetching water or chopping wood, but most flirtation is performed under the watchful eyes of family and several goats. And as yet, there's a quiet rhythm to it. Shared chores lead to shared smiles. Helping clean fish earns a grateful nudge. Holding a roof beam steady while she hammers might just be Viking love language. Historians still argue whether these early flirty signals were conscious courtship or just cooperative survival, but judging by the grin he gives her when she drops a ladle into his lap, something's simmering. Now, love wasn't always about feelings, at least not at first. Marriage was often a strategic affair, planned by families for land, alliances, or the hope of a sturdier cow. But before any agreements, people still had to live under the same thatch. And that meant learning to read the subtle signs. A longer glance over stew, a quiet helping hand during sheep shearing, or, in the rare case, a cheeky verse recited before bedtime. Yes, Vikings loved poetry. Not always good poetry, but heartfelt. You might hear something like, "Your eyes gleam like the river before it floods and takes my uncle." It's the thought that counts. Of course, not every love story began with shared chores. Some started with a glance at the thing, the Viking assembly. Picture this. You're standing among a crowd, your feet stuck in damp mud, your cloak smells like last week's herring, and across the crowd, someone catches your eye, just before someone else challenges them to a slander duel. Ah, young love. In these close-knit communities, reputation mattered. A bad match could disgrace a family, and gossip traveled faster than a raven on a tailwind. Still, affection bloomed in its own peculiar way, around smoky hearths, in long silences while sharpening tools, or through quietly shared jokes about Uncle Rolf's legendary flatulence. You roll out your bedding near the far wall wrapped in scratchy wool. Across the room, the girl who stirred the stew curls up next to her sister. The boy with the carving knife lies still, eyes open, staring into the rafters. No one speaks, but something in the air feels soft. Maybe love doesn't need candlelight or violins, just warmth, proximity, and a faint scent of smoked haddock. Still, there's tension in the air, too. Viking love wasn't just a private matter, it was a matter of law, of family, of inheritance. And you're already beginning to realize that affection here walks a thin, muddy line between personal desire and communal responsibility. Auntie Thora snores gently now. The fire crackles. Somewhere, a chicken coughs. And you close your eyes, already drifting, knowing this love story is only just beginning. You wake to the clatter of wooden bowls and the soft thud of someone stubbing a toe on the hearthstone. Morning in the longhouse is not glamorous. There's a damp chill in the air, and someone's burning porridge already. But there's something electric in the way eyes dart and shoulders brush, especially when young folks start preparing for a thing. The thing, contrary to how it sounds, is not a monster or a mysterious object. It's a public assembly, part courtroom, part market, part social media feed. This is where Vikings settle disputes, trade goods, and, if you're lucky, size up potential partners. You tug on your thick wool tunic, now slightly less damp than yesterday, and head out with the others. The path to the thing is lively. Vendors are shouting about dried fish, someone's balancing a goose on a pole, and groups of youths are pretending not to notice each other while aggressively noticing each other. Welcome to the Viking version of speed dating, the slander duel. Now, a slander duel might not seem romantic, but in Viking culture, words are weapons, carefully sharpened ones. If someone accuses you of cowardice, poor ancestry, or, worst of all, unmanliness, you don't just sulk. You either duel with swords or duel with poetry. You crouch near a circle forming in the field. Two men step forward, sleeves rolled, voices raised. One insults the other's beard. The other replies with a line so sharp it makes a grandmother snort laugh into her mead. The crowd oohs. The winner? Hard to say. But his cousin just got a very interested look from a girl who's pretending to pick herbs. See, insults in this setting aren't always malicious. Sometimes they're performative, even flirty. A well-placed jab about someone's clumsy pig wrangling might earn a smile, or at least a snort of respect. Historians still argue whether these verbal showdowns served more as courtship or as reputation maintenance, but the line is blurred, like everything else in Viking affection. You sidle up to a trio of young women watching the duel. One of them is threading her fingers through a charm bracelet made of sheep bone and dyed thread. She whispers to her friend about one of the duelists. He once tripped into a goose pen, loudest day of the year, and yet she's smiling. For Vikings, cleverness was attractive. Wits mattered. A good insult could impress as much as a bicep. The sagas are full of men and women who win hearts with their words, not just their axes. So while some were lifting barrels or flexing under the pretense of rearranging carts, others were sharpening their tongues. But it wasn't all poetry and jest. Real slander had serious consequences. If someone publicly called you ergi, a deeply offensive insult questioning your masculinity, You could sue them, or stab them, or ideally, recite a better insult and walk away with your dignity and possibly a date. Back in the longhouse that evening, you replay the day's barbs. One girl still giggles about the goose pen comment. The boy who delivered it now lounges near the fire, carving a tiny boat. Is he aware of the stir he's caused? Probably. Does he care? He absolutely does. The whole village buzzes with the energy of half-flirted glances and unspoken challenges. There's no dating app here, no swipe left, no texting under furs. Just sharp tongues, quicker smiles, and the occasional goose-related scandal. In a corner of the room, two older women swap gossip. Did you see how Fridas leaned toward him? One says, slicing dried apples. She never leans, not even during storms. Subtlety is a finely honed skill here. So is noticing when someone drops their spoon next to the person they like. You wrap your cloak tighter and drift toward the hearth, where embers glow and the air smells like pine and cabbage. It's in these tiny, overheard exchanges, the way someone adjusts their cloak to sit closer, the stolen looks across the table, the shared chuckle at someone else's joke, that Viking love lives begin to stir. And while it may seem strange that an insult could lead to affection, in this world, proving you can hold your own in a word duel might just win you more than applause. It might win you a place by someone's fire. You wake to the muffled sound of oars slapping water and the faint bark of a dog somewhere down the fjord. Today is not just any day, it's raiding season. The men are preparing their longship, packing dried fish, salted lamb, ropes, and maybe a charm or two from someone special. You wander down to the shore, where the long, dragon-headed ship bobs gently. Its hull is polished, shields line its sides like teeth, and the mood is surprisingly romantic. You weren't expecting that, were you? One boy, barely old enough to grow a beard, hugs his younger sister, then glances back, twice, at the girl handing him a pouch of smoked meat. Her cheeks are pink, her hands hesitant. You can almost hear the silent exchange. I made this, in case you don't die. Raiding might seem like a terrible basis for love, but it played a strange role in Viking courtship. While some modern romantic gestures include flowers or a well-timed meme back then, it was loot. Nothing said, I'm thinking of you, quite like returning from Ireland with a stolen brooch and only minor stab wounds. Historians still argue whether all Viking raids were driven by economic desperation, political pressure, or just a desire to travel and see the world with swords, but personal motives were certainly tangled up in it all. For some, raiding meant opportunity, not just for wealth, but for reputation. And reputation, in the Viking world, was pure romantic currency. You sit on a log, watching as two young warriors tie knots in their gear. One wears a small bronze pendant around his neck, a gift, he says casually, from a friend. His shipmate smirks and mutters, a very close friend. They both laugh. It's soft, even nervous. Not every goodbye is epic. Some are barely whispered. Now, not all romance by raiding was tender. Some Viking men did, in fact, abduct women during their travels. The sagas are full of accounts that range from poetic wooing to what modern ethics would absolutely not approve. But here's the nuance. Some of these captured women eventually became wives, property holders, and influential figures within the Norse world. Did they choose these lives? Historians still argue ferociously about that. Back home, however, love blossomed in quieter ways during these absences. Women who stayed behind weren't just passive placeholders. They ran farms, managed livestock, and maintained complex social webs. A woman whose husband sailed off might receive gifts from others trying their luck while the boats were away. Some of these temporary arrangements even became permanent. You watch one woman fold a cloth and place it gently inside a carved chest. Her husband is halfway to Francia by now, but the neighbor who brings her firewood every week has been lingering longer. She doesn't say anything, but neither does she ask him to leave quickly. Love here, like the tides, shifts. You stroll along the path above the fjord, imagining what it feels like to wait. Each longship could be gone for weeks, months, sometimes even years. One morning, you'd wake to gulls and mist, and a man who left as a farmer would return tanned, limping, clutching a fancy comb and a badly folded love poem in Old Norse. And yet not every returning man found the woman he left behind. Sometimes she had moved on. Sometimes she hadn't waited. Sometimes she had, impressively, improved her social status while he was away. Marriage in Viking society was transactional, yes, but also surprisingly fluid. Divorce was legal. Repartnering wasn't scandalous. Emotional resilience was practically a love language. You'd sit on a flat rock, feet dangling above the water as a gull cackles overhead. In this world, love and adventure are intertwined, tangled like the ropes on the ship's deck. You don't always know if someone's leaving to find wealth or to prove something to the person they left behind. But when they return, if they return, the first question isn't always, "Did you get rich?" It might be, "Did you think of me?" You're back inside the longhouse, the fire crackling low, smoke curling toward the rafters. Outside, sleet taps on the turf roof in a gentle rhythm. But inside it's business time. Not romance, not raiding, not poetry, just cold, hard negotiation. You take your place near the family elders as two clans sit across from each other on wool blankets. Someone brings out a drinking horn. Someone else spreads a fur between them and starts pulling out wooden tokens, bundles of wool, and, of course, a goat. Because love in Viking society often starts with a contract. This is the marriage agreement, less a romantic proposal, more a careful transaction. And you're about to witness all the dramatic thrill of medieval prenups. The families start to haggle, not over love, but over property. A girl's worth is partly measured in dowry, what she brings into the marriage, often in the form of livestock, land rights, a good comb, or, if the family's flashy, a silver brooch from a far-off raid. But there's another key detail, the morgengifu, or morning gift. This is what the husband gives the wife the day after the wedding, sort of a thank you and welcome package. Think jewelry, land, or a cow that doesn't bite. The value of this gift is a public sign of the groom's intentions, and also his wallet. You shift slightly, trying not to sneeze from the goat dander wafting up. The negotiation is tense, but not unfriendly. Both sides want this to work. Everyone has something to gain, and no one wants to be saddled with a lazy in-law or a cousin who drinks all the ale. Historians still argue whether women had meaningful say in these arrangements. Some sources suggest they were consulted, especially if they had status or a sharp tongue. Others hint that they were more often informed than invited to negotiate. Either way, you spot the bride-to-be sitting quietly near the wall, eyes flicking between the speakers. She may not be speaking, but she's listening hard. There's also a subtle ritual playing out here. You notice the groom's father checking the beams above, symbolically making sure the house is sturdy, a nod to the strength of the marriage-to-be. One woman ties knots in a string as she listens, possibly a quiet charm to bring luck to the couple, or maybe she's just bored. You lean closer as the talk turns to contingencies. What if the marriage doesn't work? What happens to the land, the cows, the spinning wheel? Viking marriage contracts often included divorce clauses. That's right, prenups were a thing in the 10th century. Someone mentions a ship, someone else brings up a barley field. You start to drift a little, lulled by the rhythm of careful barter. It's oddly soothing, like a business meeting where the coffee is ale and the PowerPoint slides are goats. Finally, they all nod. A deal has been struck. There's a chorus of satisfied grunts, a couple of relieved sighs, and one celebratory burp. The goat, presumably, is now off the market. But love in this world doesn't end with signatures. Okay, spoken oaths, really. This is only the foundation. The relationship will build over time, in shared chores, shared beds, and shared winters that last too long and smell too much like turnips. And the bride, she gets up, walks over, and hands her future husband a bundle of woven cloth. Not a word, just a small smile. It's not a sweeping declaration of love, but it might be the Viking version of, okay, I can work with this. As the families stand and begin packing their things, you stay seated for a moment, letting the reality of Viking romance sink in. It's not flashy, it's not passionate poetry and flowers. It's more like, can I trust you to survive with me through mud and firewood and stormy nights? You find yourself in the middle of a rowdy celebration. Your feet shuffle instinctively as drum beats echo from the longhouse walls. The scent of roasted boar hangs thick in the air, and the firelight flickers across flushed faces. A Viking wedding is no quiet affair. Today's the day the marriage contract turns into a full-blown party, and you, lucky guest that you are, have a front row seat to one of the strangest, most spirited, and slightly soggy celebrations you'll ever attend. The bride stands near the hearth, her hair intricately braided, wearing a cloak adorned with family brooches. She's calm, serious, maybe a bit exhausted. The groom, equally serious, but clearly trying not to drop the ceremonial sword he's supposed to hold upright all night. Nothing says romantic like sweaty palms and weaponry. You glance around and notice something odd. People keep looking at the groom's socks. That's because socks, and shoes especially, play a symbolic role in the ceremony. At one point, the bride is expected to place her new husband's foot into his shoe, symbolizing her willingness to support his step into adulthood. Romantic? No. Strangely adorable? Somehow, yes. The main event kicks off with oaths, witnessed by elders and hopefully not interrupted by livestock. The oaths are spoken, never written. In fact, Viking legal tradition treats verbal promises with incredible weight. You make a promise in front of the clan, you stick to it, or face social ridicule, mockery in a saga, or a stern glare from Auntie Thora. Once the formalities are done, the mead starts flowing and keeps flowing. Wedding feasts could last for days, and while there might not be a DJ, there are certainly drunken uncles attempting to recite ancient poetry with increasing confusion. The food is simple but hearty: boiled lamb, pickled fish, bread that could double as roofing material, and enough mead to drown a troll. And somewhere between the third toast and someone falling into the firewood pile, love begins to show itself, not as grand proclamations, but in laughter, eye rolls, shared scraps of meat, and subtle glances that say, well, this is happening. You sit beside a pair of older women who are placing quiet bets on how long the marriage will last. One whispers, "He seems nice now, but wait until he starts snoring like a walrus." The other chuckles and mutters, "Or until she realizes he can't chop firewood without weeping." Historians still argue how much affection these arranged couples really had. The sagas tend to exaggerate, of course, but archaeological finds, like combs, charms, and paired burial sites, suggest some relationships were deeply affectionate. Others, functional at best. As the night wears on, ritual mingles with revelry. The couple shares a ceremonial cup of mead, invoking the gods, especially Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. People shout blessings, some reverent, some suspiciously slurred. Someone throws a chicken bone over their shoulder for luck. You're not entirely sure that's part of the tradition, but no one seems to mind. Later, the couple is escorted to the bridal bed with much fanfare as a line of relatives cheer, sing, and sometimes offer awkward advice. You, wisely, stay outside, sipping warm ale beside the fire. But even here, in the quiet, something soft settles over the camp. The stars peek out, the drums fade to tapping. A woman begins singing, slowly, tunelessly, but with heart. And for a moment, the chaos of the feast becomes a lullaby. You catch the groom's younger brother practicing how to braid straw like the bride did earlier. He's trying to impress someone, poorly but sincerely, and that's the Viking way. Effort, however clumsy, matters more than polish. One last note before sleep. The bride's hair, unbound earlier in the day, is now braided again by female relatives, symbolizing her passage into womanhood. It's a small thing, quiet, no speeches. But you realize in that moment, this society, loud as it can be, marks life's transitions with astonishing tenderness. And as you curl into your furs, the last thing you hear is the flutter of a goat sneaking into the longhouse. Even they want to be part of the love story. The wedding is over, and the hangovers are historic. You step quietly through the longhouse in the gray-blue hush of early morning, weaving between snoring bodies, half-drained mead horns, and one deeply confused chicken perched on someone's helmet. The couple, newly bound by oaths, livestock, and an astonishing number of mead toasts are nowhere to be seen, presumably catching up on sleep and mutual awkwardness. But just because the feast has ended doesn't mean love has stopped working its magic. In fact, this is where things get more mysterious, and maybe just a little bit spooky. You settle near an old woman with cloudy eyes and an unsettling ability to whisper to dried herbs. She's humming softly while running her fingers over a bundle of twigs and bones wrapped in dyed cloth. This is a Seidkona, a woman versed in Norse magic, and you're about to learn that Viking love had a whole other dimension: charms, runes, and pillow-bound spells. She pulls out a piece of bone etched with lines that look like cracked frost. "Love rune," she says, not looking up. "Good for courage, or kisses, depends how you read it." You blink. Kisses? Turns out, Vikings didn't just rely on charm and muscle. They turned to literal charms, magical ones. Etched bones, carved stones, twisted cords of colored wool, all used in attempts to win affection, spark desire, or bind faithfulness. Some charms were meant to stir the heart, others to protect it. You listen as the Seidkona tells you about pillow magic, small amulets or herbs sewn into bedding to draw love or fertility. Nothing like sleeping with a bag of dried moss and iron filings under your head to keep your partner interested. Historians still argue whether these practices were purely symbolic or believed to wield real power. But given how seriously some people guarded their charms, it seems clear that belief ran deep. Even more curious are the love potions. You overhear one tale of a woman who mixed her own blood into a mead she served her reluctant suitor. Did it work? Well, they married, so either the potion succeeded or the guy was too scared to refuse seconds. You're shown another rune, this one carved into the handle of a comb. "She made him that," the old woman says, her voice like wind through pine, "brushed his beard every day." The implication is sweet, slightly ominous, hard to say. But in a world without texts or emojis, a carved comb was basically a love letter. And while we're on the subject of omens, ravens flying left before a proposal, bad luck. Dreams of a boat drifting toward shore, good. Seeing your crush eat the last smoked trout without offering a bite, that might require a revenge spell involving sheep dung and a pig skull. You begin to notice that much of this love magic was performed by women, mothers, grandmothers, widows. They passed down charms, whispered the old words, tied the knots that bound hearts, or tried to. It's a matriarchal undercurrent in an otherwise patriarchal world, and you wonder how many marriages were nudged along not by fate, but by a very determined auntie with a bundle of dried nettles. It's not all serious, of course. Some love spells were more prank than passion. You hear about a boy who tried to impress a girl by planting magical mushrooms in her shoes. He got slapped gently, but they married years later anyway. Maybe the spell just needed time. Magic wasn't limited to the love-struck either. Married couples often kept protective charms in the home against infidelity, infertility, or just plain bad vibes. A ring of iron under the bed, a bundle of horsehair above the door, a small wooden figure tucked discreetly into the rafters. You notice several of these scattered around the longhouse and realize, Viking love was watched over by more than family. It was guarded by the unseen. As you curl back into your furs, the side Kona leans close and presses a bundle of dried herbs into your hand. For dreaming, she says. Good dreams, or at least interesting ones. You smile, because of course Viking romance wouldn't be complete without a slightly unsettling bedtime gift. The days grow shorter now. You can feel it in the sharpness of the wind and the early hush that settles over the village like a woolen blanket soaked in drizzle. Fires are lit earlier, meals are longer, people linger, not for work, but for talk, and of course, for gossip. Tonight you find yourself sitting beside an old man carving a spoon. He doesn't say much until someone mentions the name of a chieftain down the coast. Then his eyebrows rise like sails in a storm. That one, he mutters, couldn't keep track of his wives if they wore bells. You perk up. Ah, yes, time to learn about polygamy, kind of. In popular imagination, Viking men are often pictured surrounded by wives, concubines, lovers, and probably some bewildered livestock. Reality? A bit more complicated and slightly more bureaucratic. Viking society, technically speaking, practiced monogamy. One legal spouse at a time, thank you very much. But certain powerful men, chieftains, jarls, kings, seemed to make a flexible interpretation of that rule. While they had one official wife, whose dowry came with legal weight, they might also maintain concubines, mistresses, or household women with varying levels of affection and patience. You sip from a horn of ale, listening to two old women whispering by the hearth. One is counting off on her fingers. His first wife gave him 3 sons. Second one, land near the lake. Third, left after he gifted her a pig instead of silver. The other nods knowingly, as though this is all perfectly standard. Historians still argue whether these relationships had any formal structure. Some believe concubines were acknowledged in contracts. Others think it was more of a social agreement. You feed me, I stay. I might name a goat after you. What's clear is that while Viking women could divorce their husbands fairly easily, a few public witnesses and a declaration would do it. Leaving a powerful man with multiple households might have been socially tricky, which is why the wives of such men tended to be strategic, clever, masters of the long stare and the slow, withering sentence. You think back to the bride who married just a few nights ago. Her mother had watched the ceremony with a face like carved stone. Maybe she'd been a first wife once. Maybe she's quietly hoping her daughter will be the only wife. Among the wealthier households, these arrangements could get crowded. Picture a longhouse with one legal wife, stirring the stew, one former lover sharpening an axe nearby, and a third woman weaving in the corner, pointedly not speaking to anyone. Add in children of uncertain parentage, and a few nosy cousins, and suddenly family dinner sounds tense. Still, many of these arrangements worked, or at least functioned. You hear of one chieftain whose wives all lived under the same roof, managed the household together, and even co-authored an epic poem about the best way to salt fish. That's one way to keep the peace. But not everyone was so lucky. One saga tells of a woman who burned her husband's ship in a jealous rage. Another recounts a concubine who carved a curse into the doorframe before leaving forever. And while that doorframe has long since rotted away, the story still echoes. As you shift on your fur mat, the fire popping gently beside you, you realize something crucial. Viking love was rarely just two people and a moonlit meadow. It was families, property, alliances, and expectations, all tangled up with emotions that weren't always convenient. Yet through it all, you spot glimmers of genuine connection. The way one woman presses a cloak into her partner's hands before he rides off. The quiet smile between a man and the woman who shares his bed and manages his accounts. And yes, even the occasional sharp glance that says, "Touch that ale horn again and see what happens." Because love, in the Viking world, wasn't just about passion, it was about endurance. The winter wind howls outside like a bored god trying out a new whistle. Inside the longhouse, the fire's warm, the stew's salty, and the tension palpable. You're seated beside a woman with crossed arms, tight lips, and the kind of stare that could freeze ale. Across from her, her husband eats quietly, as if chewing too loudly might trigger an avalanche. Tonight, you're learning what happens when Viking love goes bad, divorce style. You'd think a society built on honor duels and wolf pelts might frown on splitting up. But in truth, Vikings had a surprisingly mature view on marital incompatibility. Divorce was legal, common even, and, perhaps most shockingly, relatively easy for both men and women to initiate. You lean in as the woman stands slowly and walks to the center of the room. Without raising her voice, she says something to the effect of, "I divorce you," and names two witnesses. Then she calmly gathers her belongings, which includes a sheep, and walks out into the snow. No drama, no crying into elk stew, just a quiet exit and the dignified bleating of her new roommate. That's it. Divorce complete. Historians still argue over how often this kind of thing occurred. Saga literature romanticizes some separations and vilifies others, but archaeology suggests women maintained significant property rights. If she brought land, goods, or animals into the marriage, she was usually entitled to take them back out, plus her personal belongings, which might include a comb, a cloak, and possibly a sarcastic poem or two. Reasons for divorce varied. Infidelity, abuse, or failure to provide were all legitimate complaints. But so was bad hygiene. One story tells of a woman who left her husband because he smelled like a fish barrel and refused to bathe. Honestly, fair. And it wasn't always sad. Sometimes divorce was practical. Maybe the alliance had served its purpose. Maybe affection faded. Or maybe she just couldn't handle another winter hearing him recite the same saga in a dramatic whisper. Tonight, you hear one man mumble that his wife left him after he forgot her Morgan Gifu for 2 years in a row. The others shake their heads. "You always give the morning gift," someone mutters, "even if it's just a good chicken." But not all separations were clean. You pass by a woman burning a small bundle in the fire, maybe a charm, maybe her ex's spare tunic. Breakups here might be swift, but the emotions still linger. Even Vikings weren't immune to the sting of a silent dinner table or a favorite spoon going missing out of spite. There are also children to consider. Custody, in many cases, went to the mother, especially if she returned to her family. A divorced woman might remarry quickly, or she might live independently, managing her own farmstead with the same focus she once gave to carving bone buttons. You're surprised at how normalized all of this feels. Divorce isn't a scandal, it's more like a season, something that comes, goes, and might leave a little frostbite behind, but won't destroy you. People whisper yes, but often in sympathy, not judgment. Later that night, you watch as a divorced woman, older, sharp-eyed, respected, offers quiet advice to a girl whose husband snores like a dying moose. Keep your own keys, she says, to the grain chest and to your own peace. It's the Viking version of self-help, and it hits harder than expected. You turn in for the night, the fire still glowing faintly. Somewhere nearby, the man who got left today is quietly feeding his goats, humming a sad tune. He doesn't seem angry, just resigned. And the woman? She's already halfway down the fjord, her sheep at her side, her head held high. The moon hangs heavy and low tonight, caught like a pearl in a web of tree branches. You pull your cloak tighter and follow the soft crunch of footsteps across frost-kissed moss. Ahead, just beyond the birch grove, a faint whisper, then laughter, hushed, nervous, the kind that doesn't want to be heard. Naturally, you follow it. You're witnessing what might be the most universal expression of love across all cultures and centuries. The secret meeting. And in the Viking world, these forbidden encounters carried all the drama of a soap opera, if soap operas had more axes and elk pelts. You crouch beside a fallen log as two figures come into view, shadows flickering in the moonlight. A young woman in a wool cloak, hood drawn, her breath steaming in the cold. A boy, barely more than a teen, carrying a small pouch of dried berries like it's a royal offering. They shouldn't be here. Her family has arranged her marriage to the son of a neighboring landowner. His father is a fisherman with no land and fewer goats. But here they are, meeting in the woods like characters from a saga, just with worse shoes. This kind of love, passionate, defiant, poorly timed, is woven into Viking history like tangled fishing nets. Secret affairs, forbidden matches, desperate letters carved into wood and tossed down rivers. Historians still argue whether these tales are rare exceptions or just what survived through whispered storytelling. One saga tells of lovers who communicated by carving runes on a tree over the course of months, each side responding like a primitive, emotionally tense bulletin board. Another tells of a girl who disguised herself as a boy to serve on her lover's ship. She was eventually discovered, but instead of punishment, she was celebrated in verse. Go figure. You watch as the couple exchanges something, maybe a scrap of cloth, maybe the braided bracelet. Then, wordlessly, they part. She melts back into the trees. He walks the other way, head low, but with the faintest trace of a smile. The risks are real. If caught, she could face public shame. He could be challenged to a duel. In the best-case scenario, everyone glares and mutters for weeks. But love makes people bold, or foolish, or both. Back in the longhouse, Gossip flickers like candlelight. Did you see Gudrun's boots? Muddy. Einar's eyes look different lately. Someone stole dried fish from the storage loft. Again. But no one says anything outright. Not yet. Viking communities had their fair share of busybodies, but also an unspoken respect for privacy, especially among the young and foolish. You learn that not all forbidden love was about class. Some stemmed from clan rivalry, old blood feuds, or religious tension, especially as Christianity began creeping into Norse lands. One couple, it's said, prayed to different gods in the same house for years before finally splitting up when the wife refused to eat fish on Thursdays. Divinity meets dinner table. There were also practical issues. Remote farms meant long winters with few visitors. Cousins married cousins not out of preference, but convenience. And when options were limited, people sometimes got creative. That's how you get sagas, with people falling in love with their foster siblings, or even proposing marriage while still mourning their last spouse. Your funeral speech was so moving, one might say, "Would you like to move in?" You chuckle softly, adjusting your furs as the fire pops beside you. You remember the couple in the woods, how careful their movements were, how intense their silence felt. It wasn't grand, it wasn't poetic, but it was theirs. And you wonder, how many Viking love stories were never written, never sung, just etched into memory by moonlight and moss. The wind is picking up again, howling through the cracks in the turf roof like an old god practicing their scales. You're sitting in the longhouse, wrapped in fur, when the conversation shifts to something delicate, almost taboo. Not because it's shameful necessarily, but because it lives in the margins of Viking sagas, flickering like candlelight. Queerness. Tonight, you lean in a little closer, because this is where the stories get quieter and far more complex. You hear a story, one of those tales told only after a few too many mugs of ale, about two shield maidens who traveled together, never married men, and were buried side by side. No one calls them lovers out loud. But everyone seems to know their names still show up in fragments of local songs, often paired in verses about courage and winter survival. Were they close friends, battle sisters, or something more? Historians still argue over these fragments. Viking culture left behind plenty of records, but not much explicit language for non-heteronormative relationships. So we read between the runes. We examined burial sites with paired jewelry sets. We decode poetry that praises the beauty of a warrior's face without ever specifying gender. You hear whispers of another saga, this one about a man accused of taking a female role in bed. In Viking society, masculinity was everything, and insults often attacked one's passivity more than one's preference. So while same-sex acts weren't always condemned outright, being cast as unmanly was. Still, the lines are murky. Some interpretations suggest private tolerance paired with public performance. Do what you want, just don't get caught in a verse about it. Tonight, someone mentions a tale of a male warrior who lived alone with a younger man, shared everything with him, and never took a wife. The old woman nearby just shrugs. Sometimes two people need only each other, she says. Then she goes back to polishing a spoon, as if that settles the matter. You walk outside into the frost-bitten dark. Above, the stars feel closer than usual. You think about the gaps in the record, the spaces where real lives unfolded, unnoticed or unrecorded. How many love stories were deliberately left out? How many were never told for fear of retribution, or simply because no one knew what to call them? You crouch near the river's edge and spot a piece of driftwood snagged in the rocks. You imagine someone carving runes into something like that. Secret words of affection meant only for one other person, sent downriver in hopes of being found. Did it happen? Probably. Did it work? Who knows? But in this world of gods and oaths, you suspect even quiet love had its magic. Back in the longhouse, a lull has fallen. Most are sleeping. The fire is down to embers. Across the room, two men sit side by side, not touching, not speaking, just watching the flames. You notice their legs leaning ever so slightly toward one another, knees brushing now and then. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. And you realize the Viking world may not have had our language, our categories, or our rainbow banners, but it had people. Complex, contradictory, fiercely emotional people. And where there are people, there is love in all its forms. The longhouse hums with a low, contented murmur tonight, the sound of full bellies, tired limbs, and softly slurred singing drifting up into the beams. You nestle deeper into your cloak, half listening, until your ears catch something delightful. Poetry. Not the grand, booming kind shouted across battlefields, but the soft, awkward, slightly rhyming sort shared between hearts too nervous to speak plainly. Tonight, you're learning about the tender, occasionally cringeworthy world of Viking love poetry. Across the fire, a young man fiddles nervously with a carved piece of bone, clearly working up the courage to recite something. Finally, he clears his throat, stands, and delivers a short verse about golden hair, smooth hands, and the agony of waiting for stew. The room pauses, then someone claps. Then someone else chuckles, then the stew girl blazes and buries her face in her scarf. Victory. Vikings loved poetry. Skaldic verse was their chosen medium for flirting, mourning, boasting, and storytelling. These weren't long, flowery sonnets, but tight, complicated, highly structured rhymes full of alliteration, kennings, and the occasional eyebrow-raising metaphor. Think, your eyes are storm crow wings at dusk, or her voice is sweeter than mead warmed over a dying fire. You know, the good stuff. Historians still argue how many of these verses were meant sincerely versus performatively. Some were clear attempts at courtship, others were probably inside jokes, and others still thinly veiled roasts passed off as compliments. Viking humor was layered like an onion, one soaked in ale. You learn that many Viking men and women composed their own verses. Love poems might be carved into wooden sticks or whalebone, scratched into the walls of ships, or whispered across smoky rooms. In one famous saga, a woman rejects a man's proposal by composing a poem about his bad poetry. Brutal, but honestly iconic. In the corner of the room, an older woman recites a quote verse from memory. It's about her husband, gone now, and how he once compared her laughter to the clatter of oars on still water. She smiles faintly. He never could row straight, she mutters, but he could rhyme. You discover that poems weren't just tools for wooing, they were evidence in legal disputes, too. One saga mentions a man accused of slander for writing a poem that implied a woman was too bold in her advances. She denied it. He recited the poem in court. The judge ruled that it was slander, but also it was quite well written. Of course, not everyone's a poet. Some tried and failed gloriously, like the man who compared his lover's eyes to fish scales. Shiny, yes, but possibly the least romantic choice. Or the girl who rhymed hug with slug and accidentally started a fist fight. You ask someone nearby what the most romantic Viking verse is, and he grins, thinking. Finally, he offers, better to share a cold blanket than sleep warm alone. It's not flashy, but it fits. Before you drift off, you spot a piece of driftwood near the hearth, runes carved into its side. A love poem, half finished perhaps, or a memory preserved in rhyme. You don't read all of it, but one line catches your eye. I will wait through 10 winters, or until you pass me the salt. You smile. In a world of raids, contracts, and awkward courtships, sometimes all you need is a good line, and someone willing to laugh at it. The sky outside is bruised with evening, a gentle lavender gray that promises snow. Inside, the longhouse has quieted. Children are already tucked in their furs, and the adults sit in the glow of the hearth, nursing bowls of hot broth and memories. Tonight, you're welcomed into the presence of a woman whose gaze is sharper than any blade hanging from the rafters. She's a widow, but don't let that word fool you into picturing sorrow and fragility. This woman, she's made of carved oak and pure intent, and she's back on the love market. You watch as she speaks calmly with a man 2 winters younger than her, who's trying, rather unsuccessfully, to impress her with a tale of his prized oxen. She nods, listening politely, while peeling turnips with such focused precision that even the oxen might blush. Widowhood in Viking society was not the social exile it often became in other parts of the medieval world. In fact, some widows gained more independence after their husbands died, especially if they inherited land or wealth. Historians still argue how much legal power these women wielded, but the sagas often portray them as respected, savvy, and deeply unbothered by nonsense. This woman, for instance, owns a stretch of pasture, 3 milk cows, and a loom that spins faster than gossip. She's not interested in love for its own sake. She's interviewing candidates for compatibility, competence, and, you suspect, an ability to not be anemic before sunrise. You overhear her conversation with another potential suitor, this one a fisherman with good boots and a sense of humor. Do you snore? She asks plainly. Only after eel stew, he replies. She smirks. This one might stand a chance. The beauty of Viking remarriage is its practicality. There's no pretense. People need warmth, help with chores, shared labor, shared laughter. A good spouse could mean the difference between surviving winter and becoming a footnote in someone else's saga. You're told of another widow who turned down 3 offers in one season, one for being too eager, one for not knowing how to bake flatbread, and one because he tried to bribe her with a very ugly necklace. She eventually remarried a quiet woodcarver who let her lead the household and never once insulted her sheep. A love story for the ages. You think back to the young bride from earlier. Perhaps someday she too will sit where this widow now sits, measuring suitors not by age or biceps, but by how well they listen, laugh, and carry firewood without being asked twice. Widows also played matchmaker roles. Their experience lent them social weight, and younger women often sought their advice. Don't marry a man who chews loudly, one says. It starts with chewing and ends with him naming all your goats after his exes. The other women nod in agreement. Tonight, the widow carves a rune into a piece of wood. You ask her what it means. Patience, she says, tucking it into her pouch. And salt. She doesn't explain, and you don't ask. Some secrets belong to those who've already lived through one marriage and are considering a second only if it feels worth the wool. The fisherman lingers near the hearth as the evening deepens. He doesn't push, doesn't brag, just refills her bowl, then quietly sets his own beside hers. They eat in silence. You wonder if this is how Viking love matures, not with fire and storm, but with a gentle, steady warmth that says, I see you, I respect you, let's not waste time. The snow has finally arrived, not in fierce, blizzardy gusts, but soft, slow flakes that drift like feathers from an invisible cloak. The longhouse is extra quiet tonight, the thick air of reflection and rest settling over everyone like an extra fur blanket. You pull yours tight and scoot closer to a low, burning ember bed. Just beside it lies a rolled scroll of sheepskin, edges curled with time and firelight. One of the elders hands it to you without a word, and you gently unroll it to reveal neat, vertical lines of runes. This isn't a poem or a saga. It's older, colder, the law. And tonight, you're about to learn just how much Viking love lived, not just in hearts and hearths, but in clauses and consequences. Welcome to love in the law codes. Contrary to their rough reputation, Vikings were rule-obsessed, and when it came to relationships, courtship, marriage, divorce, infidelity, inheritance, the law wasn't vague. It was etched in tradition, oral history, and when needed, carved into stone, bone, or bark. You follow along as an elder reads from memory, her voice gravelly but sure. If a man weds a woman and gives no morning gift, she begins, pausing to smirk, he owes double if he forgets twice. Everyone chuckles. Apparently, that's a common mistake. The Gragas and other regional law codes laid out everything from dowry expectations to acceptable grounds for divorce to what happens when a goat gets caught in the wrong household. But it's the relationship laws that really show how deep Viking society intertwined love with livelihood. For instance, if a woman's husband insulted her family publicly, she had grounds to dissolve the marriage. If he struck her more than 3 times in front of witnesses, she could walk legally, and she'd take her property, her livestock, and her reputation with her. Historians still argue about the actual enforcement of these laws, how often people followed them, how often they were bent or ignored. But the very fact that they existed reveals something crucial. Viking society took relationships seriously enough to legislate them. One clause describes how lovers caught in secret trysts could be fined, not necessarily punished harshly, but shamed publicly. Another outlines what happens if a man tries to marry a woman without her family's knowledge. Spoiler, it doesn't end well for him. You glance around the longhouse and begin to recognize certain behaviors with fresh eyes. The widow who kept her sheep separate from the communal pen? Smart. Asset protection. The couple who always eats from the same bowl? Legal symbolism. Shared meals equated to shared lives. The pair who never speaks, but always braids each other's hair by the fire? Probably married under a quiet oath ceremony, legally binding if done before witnesses, and followed by the right handshakes. There's also the matter of fostering, not quite adoption, not quite babysitting. Children often lived in other households for education and alliances. But if two foster siblings married later, eyebrows would raise. The law didn't forbid it outright, but social custom frowned on it, like someone bringing uncooked fish to a funeral. And let's not forget inheritance. Viking women could inherit property, yes, but whether they kept it after marriage depended on the agreement. You hear of a woman who rewrote her father's will in verse just to ensure her spinning wheel stayed hers. Legal? Debatable? Clever? Absolutely. You trace your fingers over the scroll's runes, sharp, angular, confident. Love in this world wasn't only about hearts and poems. It was about reputation, land, animals, and future generations. And the law made sure all of it had borders. Before the fire burns out completely, the elder offers one final quote. A man who makes no oath is a man with no path. You nod, understanding now that love here isn't simply felt. It's declared, protected, and yes, occasionally argued over with a goat as witness. You wake to the steady rhythm of boots on packed snow and the muted clinking of buckles and chainmail. Morning has broken, and with it, a quiet flurry of activity. Today, a group of warriors is preparing to depart, not for plunder this time, but to defend a nearby settlement from a feud that's been simmering longer than the meat in your gut. As you follow them toward the shore, you notice something subtle and entirely unspoken. Goodbye gifts being exchanged. Small ones, but full of meaning. A braid of hair, a polished bead, a rune-carved charm pressed into a calloused palm. This isn't grand fanfare. It's intimate, tender, and utterly Viking. Love during wartime was often unspoken, but deeply understood. One man receives a pair of woolen mitts, far too finely knit to be anything but romantic. He blushes as he tucks them into his belt. Another woman hands over a small pouch tied with red thread. You're told it holds a sliver of bone and a pinch of dried herbs, a protective charm meant to keep him safe, or at least bring him back in one piece. You remember stories of Viking warriors who carried tokens from lovers into battle, rings, hair, even poems tucked into boots. Historians still argue whether these were purely sentimental or believed to be magical, but either way, they mattered. One saga even tells of a man who survived 3 wounds to the chest and credited the tiny wooden comb his wife gave him. She said it was strong, he told the healer, and I believed her more than I believed my ribs. Back in the longhouse, you watch as a woman quietly places her husband's things near the door. His helmet, oiled and ready, his cloak, folded neatly, and at the very top, a small flatbread with his initials marked in honey. Not for survival, just comfort. A portable hug in snack form. But not every goodbye was between man and woman. Brothers clasp hands without looking each other in the eye. Childhood friends lean their heads together in quiet understanding. Even a man and his dog share a moment, fur against fur, heartbeat to heartbeat, before one stays and one sails. There's no crying. That's not the Viking way, but there's plenty of silence, and in that silence, you hear everything. You're told of a practice called soul binding, an informal ritual where two people, lovers or otherwise, tied knots into a shared piece of thread before parting. The idea was simple. What is knotted can be found again. You run your fingers across one such cord, rough with age, but still venting, still waiting. As the ships begin to push off from shore, the mood shifts. The women retreat to their spinning, the children to their games, but you sense that something's been left hanging in the air. Not grief, not quite. More like hope wearing heavy boots. One woman sits alone by the fire later that night, her eyes never leaving the door. She says nothing, but beside her is a second bowl, untouched, and a carved spoon resting gently across it. Whether they return in a week or a year, or not at all, love travels with them. Woven into tunics, tucked behind belts, whispered into braided hair, and when they return, they'll be received not just with feasts and songs, but with simple acts of recognition, a hand on a shoulder. A bowl passed silently across the table, a braid carefully unknotted. You lie down that night with the soft weight of those partings still resting in your chest. Because in this world of iron and ash, what keeps you going isn't just your blade, it's who packed your lunch. The fire crackles low tonight, its glow casting long shadows that dance across woven tapestries and wooden beams. You're curled up beneath a heavy woolen cloak, your breath rising slowly in the cold air when an old woman settles beside you. She smells of pine needles, sheep fat, and something faintly metallic. In her lap, she holds a worn, braided belt. It looks ordinary until she begins to speak. This, she says, smoothing the fibers, was passed to me on my wedding day, and to my mother and hers. She smiles, revealing more story than teeth. It's for fertility, if you believe that sort of thing, or at least it makes the goats behave. You blink, and just like that, you're in the heart of one of the Viking world's quieter mysteries. The strange tangled knot between love, sex, and superstition. Tonight we talk about the fertility belt and other beliefs. Vikings lived in a world of gods, omens, and deeply personal rituals. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was something to coax, nurture, or, if necessary, bribe into existence. And when nature didn't cooperate, when marriages went childless or desires faded, people didn't just sigh and move on. They tied knots, made offerings, whispered to the gods, and slipped charms into boots and bedding. The fertility belt is one of the most enduring symbols. Usually woven from wool and colored thread, sometimes braided with beads or tiny bones. It was worn during rituals, wedding nights, or long winters when the goats were producing more offspring than the humans. Some belts were passed down, mother to daughter, or even friend to friend. Others were made in secret, whispered over, then hidden beneath beds or wrapped around cradles not yet filled. Historians still argue whether these items had any official religious sanction, but the sagas are full of casual references. She wore the red braided belt, or he thanked Freya for the harvest and his wife's belly. Speaking of Freya, the Norse goddess of love, fertility, and what one might gently call bedroom matters, she was often invoked when passion cooled or couples struggled to conceive. Offerings to her ranged from fruit and flowers to blood and song. One tale tells of a man who left a carved soapstone of his wife's face at a shrine to Freya after 3 childless years. The next year, she gave birth to twins, and he never carved another thing again. Other beliefs ran stranger still. One family believed that burying a dried apple beneath the threshold of the home would invite love in and keep quarrels out. Another swore by goat's milk poured over a shared rock outside the house each spring equinox. And then there's the curious tale of the man who placed his wedding comb in a fire during a thunderstorm, hoping Thor would strike his household into action. That didn't go well, but not all rituals were so grand. Some were quiet. A shared sip of mead under the stars. A single strand of hair braided into a cloak lining. A whispered name carved into the inside of a wooden spoon. You think of all the times you've seen someone pause at the doorframe before entering, touch the beam, and whisper nothing to no one. It's habit now. But it started somewhere, with someone hoping for love or luck, or simply less arguing over who forgot to feed the chickens. You ask the old woman if she still believes in the belt. She laughs. Believe? No. But I kept it, didn't I? She folds it neatly and places it back in her pouch, as if tucking away a secret. And in the longhouse tonight, as couples drift to sleep and goats settle by the door, you can't help but wonder how many whispered hopes float just beneath the surface of this smoky air. Love here is practical, earthy, stubborn, and quietly enchanted. You wake to the rhythmic creak of a loom, the faint click of bone needles, and the comforting hush of quiet conversation layered over the morning chill. 2 people sit side by side near the hearth, working in tandem. He's mending a leather strap. She's sewing a tear in her cloak. They don't speak much, but their glances say more than any saga ever could. This isn't new love. This is arranged, but not always unhappy. In Viking society, most marriages began not with stolen glances or breathless poems, but with contracts, dowries, and family negotiations over land, livestock, and whether the groom had enough axes to be respectable. Romance was optional, practicality was not. You glance at the couple again. There's something deeply settled in the way they move around each other, like 2 stones that have been rubbing together just long enough to smooth their edges. Arranged marriages weren't always cold or cruel. In fact, for many Vikings, they were the beginning of something deeper. Respect, companionship, and the slow growth of trust forged over winters, sickness, and shared goats. Historians still argue how much say women had in these arrangements. While elite matches were often dictated by clan strategy, there's growing evidence that many women, especially older daughters, were consulted or at the very least offered subtle veto power. You overhear a story about a girl who threw a bone at a suitor's foot as he tried to impress her parents. Message received. He left with a limp and his pride slightly dented. It's said that love sometimes followed marriage, not the other way around. You can imagine it happening like this. Two strangers bound by contract, forced to share a hearth, a bed, and far too many blisters from firewood hauling. Maybe they annoyed each other at first. Maybe they barely spoke. But over time, one learned the other's silences. One laughed first, the other brought soup when the cough came. And just like that, the arrangement became something else. You hear a woman tell her daughter, "I didn't love your father when we married, but by the time you were born, he was the only one I'd let slice my bread." It's a peculiar compliment, but you get it. There's intimacy in shared labor, mending nets, birthing calves, surviving storms. The more chores they tackled together, the more stories they gathered. Some marriages stayed formal, distant. Others turned into long, quiet partnerships filled with whispered jokes, knowing looks, and the occasional well-placed snowball fight. You remember a tale from a neighboring village of a woman who hated her husband's snoring so much she moved to the other side of the longhouse, only to miss him terribly and drag her bedding back 2 days later. "Couldn't sleep without the wheeze," she admitted. Not every arranged marriage bloomed, of course. Some stayed brittle, others broke. But when they worked, they really worked. Less like fireworks, more like a steady flame that didn't blow out when the wind came. You glance once more at the couple by the fire. He's just handed her a comb without being asked. She thanks him with a slight touch to his arm. It's not dramatic, but it's real. And in a world where feelings weren't always the foundation, but the result, maybe that's the most honest kind of love. The snow outside has softened into rain now, gentle, steady, tapping on the roof like a tired traveler asking for shelter. You stand at the edge of the village, watching a group of returning traders unpack their haul. Silk, spices, beads, combs, and stories. Because tonight, you're learning about Vikings far from home and the love lives they stitched together in foreign beds. Viking expeditions took Norse men and women all over the known world, from the green hills of Ireland to the palaces of Byzantium to the riverbanks of Kiev and beyond. And while not every journey was about romance, many came back with more than loot and sea lice. Some came back with relationships forged in ports and palaces, across cultures and languages. You settle beside a young woman who's returned from the East. Her hair is braided differently now, with ribbons woven in a pattern you don't recognize. She hums a tune that doesn't match any local saga. And on her wrist, a bracelet inlaid with tiny bits of amber and glass, gifted, she says, by someone who spoke softly and smelled like honey and leather. Historians still argue how often these unions occurred out of affection versus necessity or force. There's no ignoring the darker truth that some relationships were unequal, even coercive. But there were also real connections, partnerships forged through trade, service, and shared survival. You hear one tale of a Norse warrior who stayed behind in Byzantium after serving in the Varangian Guard. He married a local woman, raised children with names from both cultures, and never returned to Norway. Another story tells of a Viking woman who was captured, then freed, and later chose to stay in Ireland, where she married a local farmer and taught him how to build a proper roof that didn't leak. Love abroad wasn't always legal. It wasn't always accepted, but it happened, quietly, stubbornly, and often out of sight. Some Viking men brought foreign wives home, which sometimes caused tension. "She doesn't speak our tongue," an elder once grumbled. "She doesn't need to," the husband replied. "She listens better than you ever did." Others never made it back, choosing instead to build new lives in foreign soil, with new names, new gods, and new kinds of love. And let's not forget the seafaring women, yes, they existed, who traveled for trade, pilgrimage, or adventure, and found companionship on the road. A saga fragment mentions two women who ran a bathhouse together in the East. Never married, it says, but always together. Read into that what you will. Love across borders also birthed a unique language, shared gestures, simple runes scratched into stone, a touch here, a glance there. You imagine two people from different worlds, unable to speak each other's words, but managing just fine with smiles, laughter, and an occasional, highly expressive shrug. Back in the longhouse, a man returns from years abroad and unwraps a folded cloth. Inside is a tiny glass bead, the kind not made anywhere in the North. He gives it to a girl who isn't his wife, but whose face lights up anyway. A gift from someone who taught him how to make stew properly. "Too much salt," he mutters. "She made me better." You realize then that Viking love wasn't just a local phenomenon. It crossed seas and cultures, sailed up rivers, wandered through markets, and settled in unfamiliar beds with hopeful hearts. Love, like the tide, goes where it pleases. Rain drums gently on the thatch roof above, a steady rhythm that lulls most of the longhouse into near silence. The flames flicker lower tonight, and across the room, a circle of people gather, not for gossip or mead, but to speak with the gods. You settle in beside them, wrapped in your cloak, as the old priestess lights a bundle of herbs and closes her eyes. Her voice is quiet, but commanding, and the words she speaks are older than memory. Tonight, you learn that even Viking love needed divine approval, or at least a little help from the supernatural. This is sacrifice and sentiment, the gods' role in Viking romance. To the Norse mind, love was never just human. It was divine, fickle, dangerous, and full of sacred risk. For every marriage, courtship, or even one-sided crush, there was often a prayer, an offering, or a whispered plea sent into the smoke above the hearth. You watch as a young woman kneels before a small altar to Freyja, the goddess of love, fertility, and passion. She places a carved wooden pendant at the base and murmurs a request. It's private, but the others don't interrupt. This is not strange. It's expected. Freyja was beloved not just for her beauty, but for her complexity. She was a warrior, a weeper, a wanderer, and in matters of the heart, the one most likely to listen when things got messy. Offerings to her varied widely: flowers in spring, a few drops of blood on polished stones, slices of apple, even tears, which were said to be her favorite, especially when they came from longing. You learn that men and women alike prayed to Freya when seeking partners, children, or even forgiveness after harsh words. Some carved her symbols into bedposts. Others wore amulets or inscribed her name in secret on the inside of their boots. But it wasn't just Freya. Thor, the hammer-wielding thunder god, was often invoked to bless marriages, especially to ensure protection and strength. Loki, ever the troublemaker, was sometimes asked to stir up boldness or to distract in-laws during awkward conversations. Historians still argue how literal these rituals were. Did people truly believe the gods answered? Or were these acts symbolic, a way to express hope, resolve, or vulnerability in a world that didn't exactly have therapists? You suspect it was both. Tonight, a boy sets a carved fish beside the fire. For Njord, he says simply, the sea god, father of Freya, guardian of long-distance love and safe journeys. You wonder who he's missing. One woman recounts the story of her own courtship, how her lover brought her a fox pelt after she left a barley cake at Freya's shrine. Coincidence? She laughs. Maybe, but I married him anyway. You hear whispers of more intense rituals, too, of couples joining hands over sacrificed animals, of spells to bind souls across distances, of people swearing oaths by the gods that, if broken, could curse not just them, but their descendants. Love here wasn't just powerful, it was risky. A man near the wall taps his fingers against the hilt of his blade. I once promised Freya I'd stop drinking if she gave me a wife who didn't mind goats, he says. Still drink, but she never minded the goats. The others laugh, but there's a softness behind it. Everyone knows what it means to pray for someone, silently, secretly, desperately. Later, when the offerings are finished and the embers start to cool, the priestess draws a symbol in the ash, a simple spiral. For love that returns, she whispers, then blows it away, and you feel it, that longing that never quite goes away, even in a world filled with axes and contracts. The hope that somewhere a god is listening. Morning returns with the sound of wooden combs tugging through knots and someone loudly losing an argument with a goat. You rub your eyes, sit up slowly, and notice something immediately different in the longhouse atmosphere. It's louder, sillier, filled with shrieking laughter, and at least one boy chasing another with a fish. It's youth, specifically Viking youth. And today, you're about to witness the chaos and curiosity of childhood crushes and teen trouble. In a world where adulthood came fast, often around age 12 or 13, it's easy to assume Viking kids skipped right past adolescence. But even in a culture that prized toughness, teenage hearts still fluttered and broke and did incredibly dumb things for attention. You watch as a girl about 13 braids her hair with painstaking care, glancing every few seconds toward a boy practicing axe throws outside. He hasn't noticed her yet, or maybe he has, and he's just pretending he hasn't. Either way, you can almost hear her thoughts from here. If I add one more bead, maybe he'll trip. Over by the hearth, a group of girls sits around a comb, giggling. One is carving something into it with a knife, deliberately shielding the inscription with her cloak. You sneak a peek when she's not looking. It's a rune-stitched name, or part of one. You can't tell whether it's a declaration of affection or a plan for revenge. Historians still argue how much freedom Viking teens had in matters of love. Some claim courtship was tightly managed by families. Others argue that informal, pre-marriage relationships were normal, especially in rural areas. What's clear is that feelings ran high, even if the tools to express them were limited to poorly carved runes, aggressive wrestling matches, or food offerings left conspicuously beside someone's sleeping mat. One boy proudly announces that he's caught the biggest trout in the river and plans to give it to the girl with the best laugh. Not the prettiest? Someone teases. No, he replies. She laughs like a goose with hiccups, and I like it. Bold strategy. You see a pair of teens disappear behind the woodpile, only to return 10 minutes later with twigs in their hair and suspiciously red cheeks. They pretend nothing happened, which of course makes it more obvious. And then there are the awkward declarations, like the boy who gifted a girl his prized horn cup, only to watch it be used to feed the dog. Or the girl who tried to sing a verse she heard in a saga and forgot halfway through, panicking and inventing a new ending involving ducks. Still, these attempts, however fumbling, are met with more amusement than judgment. Viking adults have seen it all before. One older man chuckles, "Let 'em make mistakes now. Better they learn heartbreak from goats than from gold." There's even a kind of ritual teasing that happens in the community. A teenager gets caught staring too long. Someone starts humming a wedding song. Two teens happen to walk back from the woods at the same time. The entire longhouse applauds. You come across a story scratched onto a piece of birch bark and left by the fire. It's a love poem, or part of one, written in a mix of shaky runes and stylized flourishes. "You smell like honey and smoke," it reads, "and I would fight a bear for your braid." You're not sure if the author meant that literally, but you quietly hope they don't try. In Viking life, love wasn't reserved for adults. It began in stolen glances, competitive chores, and deeply chaotic declarations. It was shaped by awkwardness and impulsive charm, and always watched over by a full chorus of relatives, pretending not to interfere. Before bed, you see two teens arguing over a carved comb, their faces flushed with frustration. But when one walks away, the other carefully tucks the comb into their pouch, holding it like a treasure. That's young love for you. Loud, clumsy, ill-advised, and somehow deeply eternal. The wind tonight is quiet. No howling, no rain, just a soft breeze that rustles the sod roof like a lullaby made of grass. The fire burns low, sending long ribbons of orange light across the floor, where you see two old hands resting, fingers gently entwined. You've returned to the same longhouse where this journey began, but now you're sitting beside a couple who have spent decades together, through blizzards and births, feasts and funerals, plagues and potatoes. You're here to witness the gentle, often overlooked beauty of growing old together by the hearth. They don't say much. In fact, for the first 10 minutes, they simply sit, watching the fire like it's telling them a story only they can hear. Every once in a while, One leans toward the other to say something like, "I told you the stew needed more salt," or "Your feet still smell like old boots," and the other just smiles, a soft smirk full of memories. In the Viking world, growing old was a privilege. Many didn't make it past their 30s. So a couple like this, gray-haired, slow-moving, still sharing space and warmth, is quietly revered. You watch as she refolds his cloak, even though he insists it's fine. You see him gently untangle the fringe of her shawl, murmuring, "That goose has been chewing on it again." It's love without spectacle, love shaped by time and repetition. Historians still argue whether long-term affection was common or simply necessary. But among the artifacts and sagas are hints, paired burial sites, shared grave goods, poems written not to lovers, but to partners. There's a tale of a couple who made matching bone combs, each etched with a version of the same line: "What I keep, I share. What I share, I keep." You learn that older couples sometimes slept in separate bedding areas, not from lack of love, but for comfort. And yet, they'd still rise in the morning, meet at the hearth, and share the first piece of bread together. A quiet ritual of togetherness. You watch this pair share a bowl of stew, scooping slowly, deliberately, like it's the finest feast they've ever had. They argue gently over whose turn it is to stoke the fire, and he eventually gets up, muttering, "If I let you do it, we'd wake up frozen to the floor." She grins, "And you'd still blame me." Their adult children visit occasionally, dropping off firewood, kissing cheeks, offering help that's politely refused. "Let us be old," the woman says once. "It's the only thing we haven't rushed." They tell you stories, not in the way of boasting, but as if they're leaving breadcrumbs for whoever comes next. Of their wedding day, when the goat escaped halfway through the ceremony. Of the winter she got sick, and he sat up all night feeding her spoonfuls of broth. Of the day he lost a toe and insisted on naming the remaining ones. There's a tenderness here that no saga can fully capture, no poetry required, no magic spell, no gods intervening. Just two people still choosing each other every day, even when the days have grown short and the fire is just enough to warm their knees. You lie down nearby, watching them one last time as they shift under their furs. She places her hand on his chest, and he mumbles something that sounds suspiciously like a snore, but with affection curled around the edges. You smile, knowing this is the truest kind of Viking love, not forged in battle, not carved in runes, but simmered slowly over decades, like stew left on the fire until it's just right. And now, as the coals settle and the longhouse quiets, let the world outside blur. Let the wind carry away the clamor of thought, and the heavy doors of the day gently creak shut behind you. The hearth flickers its final embers. The scent of peat smoke and wool lingers in the air like an old lullaby, one you've heard before in a dream, or maybe just imagined. Outside, snow or rain or silence blankets the land. It doesn't matter. Here, you're warm, safe, still. You've walked alongside stories full of whispered longing and tangled hair, of slander duels and fish-smelling kisses, of young glances and old hands still reaching for each other in the dark. You felt the hush of secret meetings, the quiet ache of farewell braids, and the soft laughter shared between furs and firelight. Love, in all its strange, unpolished, wind-blown forms, lives in every creaking beam and every shared bowl. It's in the way someone stays, the way someone stirs the stew without asking, the way someone folds your cloak without being told. So breathe deeper now. Let your muscles soften, your thoughts loosen. Let the rhythm of this world, its storms and silences, settle into your bones like a lullaby sung in a language older than time. You're not alone in this longhouse of dreams. There are stories resting beside you, and they're still whispering gently. Sleep now, traveler. You've earned the rest. Sweet dreams.